heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live, this is Point of View. And now, Kirby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. We're broadcasting live today from Augusta, Georgia. This is an opportunity for us to spend some time really talking about the important issues of the day, and we certainly are so grateful of the material and resources that are always provided by our good friends here at the Good News Network. And we're going to be looking at a book interview in just a minute, but I thought in some respects some of the things that have been happening in our program are certainly very helpful to us understanding what is taking place. Yesterday you might have noticed, if you watched the news, that President Donald Trump gave a very significant speech at the Museum of the Bible. Now, the reason for that was it was the second hearing of the Religious Liberty Commission. As we've talked about before with Kelly Shackelford, there are all sorts of individuals, kind of a who's who of individuals, and he talked about the real important need for us to think about this country from a biblical point of view. And even there, he said, we have to bring religion in America. To have a great nation, you have to have religion. Of course, we're looking at that from a godly point of view, and this is part of kicking off what is called the America Prays Initiative, which really is inviting Americans to rededicate the nation as one nation under God, which you might have noticed is the most recent booklet that we've produced as part of the nation's 250th anniversary. And while I'm mentioning Kelly Shackelford, it was interesting that one of the individuals that the president introduced was a middle school student who is one that Kelly Shackelford and First Liberty have been actually representing, and he was forced to read a book about gender identity to a kindergarten student. The argument was, well, we have a mentor, so we'll have these older students mentor young students, and yet here he was saying, I feel really uncomfortable about talking about the gender identity issues, and they talked about how the student was mocked and bullied after his parents objected. So we're certainly going to be getting into that more in the second hour, but I think it also illustrates something else, and that is we had Senator Tim Kaine last week, and he is a senator from Virginia, at the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, in which at one point, as an individual had given a testimony and was going to, through confirmation, Senator Kaine said that this notion that rights don't come from laws and don't come from the government, but come from the Creator, that's what the Iranian government believes. It's a theocratic regime that bases its rule on Sharia law and targets Sunnis, Baha'is, Jews, Christians, and other religious minorities. They don't do it because they believe they understand what natural rights are from their Creator. So the statement that our rights do not come from our laws and government is extremely troubling. It would have been helpful if he had maybe thought of the words by someone else from Virginia by the name of Thomas Jefferson, who in the Declaration of Independence said, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their what? Their Creator with certain and inalienable rights. And that's why we thought in this first hour we'll spend some time talking today with Dr. Thomas Albert Howard. He is professor of humanities and history at Valparaiso University. He is an individual that has his PhD to actually look at this issue of the human issues and historical issues. He also holds the chair of Christian ethics at Valparaiso University, and he is an individual in the past when he was at Gordon College was very much involved in some of the work that was there, in particular the Center for Faith and Inquiry. One of the things I've appreciated about him is he writes for things like First Liberty, and he actually has written a very good piece of the Reformation at 500 that appeared in First Things. This new book is called Broken Altars, Secularist Violence in Modern History, and we're going to be talking about that, but I might also just give you a preview for one he's working on, Modern Christian Theology in Intellectual History. And Dr. Howard, I know we call you Tall. It is a delight to have you on the program today.
It's great to be here. Yeah, Tal, that's what I generally go by. But it's
well, very good.
Thomas Albert.
Yes, I understand that. Well, let's see if we can get into this, because one of the things we get from the Enlightenment is the idea that violence is somehow part of religion. And our friend, and I put it in quotes, Richard Dawkins, said that the thing about religion is it's dangerous, it's violent. He says, I'm attacking gods, all gods, anything, everything supernatural, wherever it is. Sam Harris even said that we should treat religion like slavery. But as I read through your book, I'm concluding that, well, there are some times in which religion and religious ideas have been violent, and we certainly don't want to discount the Taliban or Shiite or Sunni Muslims or radical Muslims or even the Crusades or the religious wars. But if you want to look at progressive regimes that are committed to secularism, it seems to me that one of the reasons you wrote the book is to remind people that that's where some of the greatest violence has occurred.
Yeah, that's right. The Enlightenment's a very complicated thing happening in the 18th century, and there are many different strands of that. Some more valuable than others, but I think one strand that does emerge from what some scholars have called the radical Enlightenment is a type of militant secularism that sees the church, especially organized religion, and the church, the heartland of the Enlightenment was France, and there was a really strong animus against the Catholic Church at that time, and at least some strands of secularism, as I argue in the book, have tipped into violence or helped justify sort of radical utopian projects that have led to a lot of death. I mean, there's many things that contributes to some of the violence in the 20th century and the regimes, but I don't think that secularism, or at least I define a couple of strands, has been given its due and looked at in broader historical perspective. So that's what I was trying to do in this book.
Well, yeah. And let me just mention, for those of you that like to take notes, you might number 1 to 3, because we're going to be talking about passive secularism, combative secularism, and eliminationist secularism, and we're going to give you examples of that. And it's just a reminder of the fact that there has been such an attempt, especially on some of the individuals that have been identified as the so-called new atheists, to say that really it is religion that is dangerous. And certainly that has sometimes been the case in the past, but nothing can even begin to come close to what happened in a fairly short period of time with some of these individuals. So we come back from the break. I want to first of all focus on what most of us sort of take for granted, and that is what you might call a passive secularism. The idea that there should be a separation of church and state as institutions, the idea that we should not favor religious ideas and the like. And that is what has maybe lulled us into believing that that's the other kinds of secularism, but really especially after World War II, I think it's even more clear to see that we've seen combative secularism, really even after World War I, and then eliminationist secularism. So we're going to certainly focus on some of that. It's all part of this book called Broken Altars, Secularist Violence in Modern History. It is published by Yale University Press, endorsed by a number of people that we know, including George Weigel at the Ethics and Public Policy Center and a variety of others. And so when we come back, going to spend some time talking about the dangers that many of us face around the world. All that coming up right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kirby Anderson.
I have two neighbors that illustrate what is happening and will continue to happen in the housing market. One neighbor just sold their house for a much lower price than anyone in the neighborhood would have expected. The other neighbor bought two homes and used them as rental properties. They now live in one of those homes. People in the other rental home haven't paid their rent for 4 months. They had to go to court to evict them. They are beginning to reconsider whether rental properties are a good investment. The U.S. housing market has nearly 500,000 more sellers than buyers. In case you are wondering, this is the most on record. In some locations like Miami, sellers outnumber buyers by roughly 3-1. It's reasonable to assume that home prices will fall. Another news report documents how many frustrated home sellers have decided to pull their property off the market. In fact, I might mention another neighbor whose home has been on the market so long they will probably pull it off the market. 3 decades ago, I wrote a book of trends concerning baby boomers. One prediction I made was the possibility that home prices might drop. The baby boom was followed by a baby bust. That would be where you would have more sellers than buyers. The housing crisis of 2008 seemed to be a fulfillment of that. But companies like BlackRock began buying homes as investments since they were appreciating assets. If the price of houses drops, they might not be a good investment in the future. They may put even more houses on the market. If this happens, it might be good news for young people wanting to buy a home, but it would also be bad news for people or corporations who need to sell a house. I'm Kirby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kirby's booklet, A Biblical View on Critical Race Theory, go to viewpoints.info/CRT. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, broadcasting live from Augusta, Georgia today. As we've been traveling around, really have enjoyed the great hospitality that they have shown us here at the Good News Network. We'll be talking to people in Georgia and South Carolina throughout the week, and certainly do encourage you to go to the website today to find out a little bit more, not only about this book, Broken Altars, but also about some of the material we're going to be talking about in the second hour, which gets into, for example, what about what is happening in England right now in terms of free speech and the arrest of Graham Lineman, the whole question about where our rights come from, as I alluded to just a minute ago, and a variety of other issues. But we will continue our conversation today with Dr. Tal Howard, and he is the author of the book Broken Altars, Secularist Violence in Modern History. And before we look at the three types of secularism, could you perhaps give us a little bit of a definition for secularism so that we're all working off of the same definition?
Yeah, it's an interesting word. I mean, it has a longer history in the Catholic Church that makes a distinction between the religious orders, mainly monks who are in monasteries, and the secular or priesthood, those who are out in the world. But in the modern period, it either means usually one of two things. First, it can mean political arrangements, like the types of separation of church and state, or just the role of the government vis-a-vis religious issues. So that's more of a political definition, or it can have a more social or cultural connotation as well, and that means sort of like people becoming less religious, society becoming less religious. So it can be a little confusing sometimes because these two, its political meaning and its social meaning can overlap a little bit.
So first of all, I would encourage people, if they take notes, and I know a lot of them do, and of course I'd also encourage them to get a copy of this book, which we have there. They can look for it in their local bookstore, but since it's published by Yale University Press, we have a link so people can get it in hardback or Kindle. But the first one is this idea of passive secularism, which, if you think about it, is sort of related to the First Amendment, certainly related to individuals, whether they were strong Christians or maybe very skeptical about religion, who all concluded that the idea of keeping the church as an institution and the state as an institution separate. And certainly that's what most of us, when we talk about secularism in the West, are really concluding, aren't we?
That's right. I mean, I developed some of these ideas in another book that focuses more on passive secularism. It's called God in the Atlantic America, Europe, and the Religious Divide. But briefly, I think it would be more of a First Amendment view, that the government should not establish a church or religion that was sort of officially established, but it generally tends to give religious individuals and communities a wide berth in how they live out their faith, and even recognizing that faith communities, bring important things to the table, and including encouraging, morality and good behavior, and those types of things. So it's, I say it's not uniquely an American thing. I think there's, particular importance here in the United States. But in the book, I also profiled the Belgian Constitution of 1831, and a number of Western democracies would have some form of this type of secularism, what I call passive secularism.
So again, that one will sort of lead to the side, although I think it's helpful to recognize that sometimes that's what we have in our mind. But now I want to get to combative secularism, and I misspoke before because really that goes all the way back to France. It goes back to the French Revolution, and it certainly is something that we saw in the latter part, I would have to say, of the 18th century. Can you explain kind of that? Because then that will lead in a little bit later to the third kind of secularism, but this is where there is a greater antagonism in this issue of church and state. Can you explain?
Yeah, you could trace this strand back to the Enlightenment and French Revolution, and some of the philosophers or intellectuals in the Enlightenment, such as Voltaire, famously said, "Crush the thing," and the thing he meant was the Catholic Church. His contemporary Diderot, another philosopher of the Enlightenment, has similar ideas. But I argue in the book it really came to the fore in the 1790s during the most radical stages of the French Revolution, when there was this process that historians call de-Christianization, and many of the monasteries and churches were closed or looted. Priests had to make a special vow of loyalty to the government. A number of churches, most infamously Notre Dame, were turned into a temple of reason for a period, and it was really, it was anti-religious to a degree. Certainly, sometimes historians use the term anti-clericalism because it was directed especially to organized religion in the Catholic Church. But what I argue in the book is that, it kind of came to the fore at that time historically, but it sort of left a ideological current into the 19th and the 20th century. So it had an afterlife, in other words.
And again, Voltaire was against, of course, organized religion. But let me bring on, because even when you go to Napoleon, first of all, there's this argument that a lot of this ecclesiastical art was relics of superstition. Napoleon referred to monks as worms and madmen. So I think there is sometimes a tendency to see that as maybe a blip in history during the French Revolution. But one of the quotes that I have in our little booklet on a biblical point of view on the new atheist, Christopher Hitchens, says, "It has become necessary to know the enemy, which is religion, and prepare to fight it." So even to this day, some of the more virulent anti-Christian ideas at least harken back, at least philosophically, to some of those ideas that come from the French Revolution, don't they?
Yeah, I think you could trace strands of them back there. Probably before the 18th century, you wouldn't have voices like that. So I think you could make that argument. You mentioned Napoleon, but he figures in the book at several points. But
yes,
he made a more pragmatic compromise with the Catholic Church. It's called a concordat in the early 19th century, 1801. But as his armies went abroad in Europe in the early part of the 19th century, they pillaged many churches, stole art from monasteries, and If Napoleon stood for anything, it was for a powerful and expansive state, and you immediately recognize religious institutions and their durability and their the fact that they own land as a opponent to a statist figure like Napoleon.
So again, we're talking about passive secularism, combative secularism. Now the one that we'll probably spend most of our time talking about, eliminationist secularism. And here we're really talking about Karl Marx, Ludwig Feuerbach, people like that. Can you kind of, again, expand that one for us just a little bit?
Yeah, this is a term I took from an anthropologist of the Soviet Union named Sonia Luhrmann. And, many people know that Karl Marx famously defined religion as the opiate of the masses. He himself did not write that much about religion per se, but focused more on economic and social issues. But as that idea was incorporated in radical strands of socialism and anarchism, communism in the 19th century, certainly you see this in Vladimir Lenin in the late 19th and early 20th century, it was, produced an idea that it's, better for all of humanity that religion disappear completely. And that was, what they were, I'll maybe just focus on Lenin, what he saw himself doing on his political agitation. And then after the Bolsheviks, the communists come to power in 1917, there was a desire to sort of eliminate religion. Marx yes. saw this as a little more sort of an evolution of history that eventually it will come about once the proletariat, the communist revolution takes place. But Lenin takes it in a much more activist direction. And I could elaborate on that, but you let me know if that's the answers the question that you asked.
Yes. Well, let me just come into a break, and when we come back, I really want to focus then on the application, because you have chapters on Soviet severities, Eastern Europe, Red Asia. One of the things my graduate professors required me to do in learning about Marxism is to read Lenin and Marx and Freud, as well as Stalin and even Mao. And we're going to get into what actually happens with these ideas, these secularist ideas, as they spread across Europe and Asia. And it's all part of this book, Broken Altars, Secularist Violence in Modern History. If you find yourself saying, I'd like to know a little bit more about the book or some of the other articles we'll be referring to today, you can find those at the website, pointofview.net. Let's take a break. We'll continue our conversation right after these important messages.
Many years ago, they began saying that we live in the information age. Well, today there is so much information coming at us from every direction. The hardest thing is to discern which issues are really important and how can I make a positive impact without wasting my time trying to figure out accurate information. Let me give you a suggestion to help with that. Visit pointofview.net. Look at the tabs across the top. Find the one named Viewpoints. Kirby Anderson and others on our team are constantly watching for news to identify those issues that you really need to know about. They boil things down in a brief summary, and then you can decide if it's something on which you want to learn more and get involved. Again, when you go to pointofview.net, click on Viewpoints, you'll see exactly what I mean. You'll see the issues that we are covering right now. And when you like what you see, I honestly think you will, you can slide on over, enter your email, and get them automatically sent to your inbox each day. That's it. Take a minute now, be informed. Pointofview.net, click on Viewpoints. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kirby Anderson.
Back once again, broadcasting live from Augusta, Georgia, as we're traveling around and meeting a number of our donors, and certainly we appreciate the great hospitality today of the Good News Network, broadcasting from their studios and talking today with Dr. Tal Howard. Again, the book is entitled Broken Altars, Secularist Violence in Modern History, and we've been talking about the different kinds of secularism, but I think it brings us now to a quote that we've used before from Dinesh D'Souza when he's been on the program, in which he said, religion-inspired killing simply cannot compete with the murders perpetrated by atheistic regimes. We're going to talk about that in just a minute. He says the death caused even by Christian rulers over a 500-year period amounts to only 1% of the deaths caused by Stalin, Hitler, and Mao. And certainly, Professor, one of the chapters that you have, Chapter 3, talks about the Soviet Union. And as you pointed out, Marx just thought that religion would fade away. But then you come to Lenin and Trotsky and Stalin, and you take it all the way up to people like Nikita Khrushchev, Leonid Brezhnev, even Mikhail Gorbachev. And this hostility towards religion becomes a violent kind of eliminationist secularism, doesn't it?
The quote by D'Souza, I think he nicely recognizes, that should be recognized, that there is violence in Christian history as well, but just on the scale in the 20th century, when you look at the Soviet Union and also especially in Maoist China, you have staggering death tolls. Not all, I would say, called directly by atheism or secularism, but it was a contributing factor, I think. And just to focus on Lenin, once the Bolshevik Revolution happened after 1917, many of the key leaders recognized that the Russian Orthodoxy had a real hold on the people, and it needed to be combated more vigorously than classical Marxists would view, that would say it just should peter out eventually in time. So in the 1920s, many priests were killed, bishops were killed, churches were plundered, monasteries were plundered, and it was quite a disaster for the church. Also, lots of atheist or anti-religious propaganda propagated by this one semi-official organization called the League of the Godless, or League of the Militant Godless. That's a sad reality.
Well, and again, let me use the cover of your book, because what that is a picture of the destruction in Moscow of the Cathedral of Christ the Savior, which happened in the 1930s. And again, it was, I think, a very arresting picture to see on the cover of your book. You also, of course, have a picture of it inside the particular text. But it's an illustration that even these great cathedrals, today, if you were to say, let's just blow up Notre Dame or a variety of other cathedrals anywhere in Europe, there would be horror. And yet that's exactly what was taking place in the Soviet Union. And it was more than just, well, you can live over there with your sort of idol worship, your belief in God, or your supernatural views, or even your suspicions, or your various kinds of biases. No, it was, we need to rid you of that. And I mentioned earlier Kelly Shackelford. He points out that it is amazing how many times it's the first attack against religious liberty, because if you're a dictator, it seems to me that you can't have someone believe that there is something more important than the state. So you have to get rid of people who believe that there is a God, or believes in natural rights. And it does seem to me that that is the only explanation you come to, when originally Marxism was just going to say, well, we think religion is going to fade away. there was instead a real deliberate attempt to eradicate any kind of religious ideas, whether it was, as you point out early on, against Orthodox churches, or even having to deal with the fact that many of the places where the Soviet Union was, you actually had Muslims as well. And so it wasn't just anti-Christian, it was anti-Muslim. And of course, we've had Dennis Prager on here talking about the Soviet attack against Jews. So can you speak to that? Because in some respects, there was a desire to remove any kind of religious ideas and supplant that with this kind of secularism, wasn't there?
Yeah, there was, especially under Stalin, who secures power in a feud with Leon Trotsky, and he's really in the driving seat from the late 1920s onward. And he's really an equal opportunity offender. So Muslims and Jews and Christian, also there were 3 Buddhist enclaves in the Soviet Union, and they experienced persecution as well. So with him, you have sort of a compound of Marxist-Leninist ideology about religion with a authoritarian personality who wants to establish an essentially totalitarian state, and religious communities are real roadblocks to that. So sadly, the destruction of the cathedral on the cover of my book was not just a one-off affair, but a staggering number of churches were either closed or destroyed. By the time World War II broke out, what were roughly 50,000 operating churches were only down to around 100 in the late 1930s.
One of the things I appreciate about your book is you take it also to Eastern Europe, and I'll just pick one of the examples there, Romania. One, because, first of all, I tend to speak and teach in Hungary, and up until recently would have been speaking in Ukraine. I think people can understand why I'm not doing that. I have my colleagues speaking in Romania, but it's also the place where Lutheran pastor Richard Wurmbrand, we oftentimes talk about the voice of the martyrs, was there. So these ideas of wanting to purge religion in the Soviet Union were not just in Russia or even in the countries next to Russia. It was happening in almost any one of the Soviet bloc countries, wasn't it?
Yeah, that's right. After World War II, the states in Eastern Europe, on the other side of what Winston Churchill famously said, an Iron Curtain, adopt Marxist-Leninist ideologies. There are differences between them, but Romania, especially under the dictator Nicholas Ceausescu, was quite repressive to most religious communities. I mean, they sort of made a bit of a collusion with the Orthodox Church in Romania, but Lutherans and Baptists and a number of religions were persecuted. I actually traveled in Romania before the wall came down, so I was able to see a little bit of this firsthand.
And again, tearing down churches, taking Bibles, turning them into toilet paper. Of course, you mentioned Czechoslovakia, you mentioned Albania, and a number of others. And so oftentimes, one of the things we talk about on this program is the persecution of Christians. And historically, in the past, those tended to be those communist countries. Now, some of the greatest persecution is taking place in the Muslim countries, but I'm not ignoring the fact that still in places like North Korea, China, Albania, and places like that, that's still persecution. But some of the greatest persecution is with these in the Muslim countries as well. But I think it illustrates again that whether you look at the Soviet Union, you even had a section here about Spain, and one of the most arresting pictures in your book is showing a guillotine, which is actually coming from a Spanish anti-clerical magazine during the 30s. I mean, if you had told me that that was a picture that came from the French Revolution, I would have accepted it. But here it illustrates again that this very virulent and virulent anti-religious and anti-Christian mindset was found in a lot of European countries. And it's something that, again, I appreciate you documenting in your book.
Well, thank you. During the Spanish Civil War, almost 7,000 clergy, including 13 bishops, were killed. So that was a very virulent anti-clericalism. And sometimes that's overlooked, but I argue in the book, too, that this is sort of a gift to Franco, who became the leader, sort of a dictator, and certainly dictatorial in his own sense, but it kind of engendered a backlash as well. Could I mention something about Albania real quick?
We're coming to a break, so let's do it after the break, and then I'll let you mention Albania because that is a very important issue, and then we'll get into the issue of Red Asia because that, of course, gets us into the issue of China and the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution, but also Pol Pot and a number of others. But we do have a break coming up, so while we do so, let me just mention real quickly, this book again is entitled Broken Altars, Secularist Violence in Modern History. It's the kind of book I wish we had years ago when we found ourselves kind of going back and forth with our so-called new atheist friends. And I used to oftentimes say that you are kidding yourself if you think that by getting rid of religion, you're going to get rid of violence, you're going to get rid of any kind of attacks against individuals. In some respects, you're going to bring on something that's even worse than what you think you need to replace. But this book is a very vivid reminder of that. And so again, we'll come back and continue our conversation right after these important messages.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes while we continue our conversation today with Dr. Thomas Albert Howard. The book is entitled Broken Altars, Secularist Violence in Modern History. Next hour, we're going to get into some of the issues in the news. A lot of issues to cover here as we're broadcasting today from Augusta, Georgia, and the Good News Network studios. And Tal, first section, you were going to talk about Albania, so I thought I'd turn it back over to you.
Yeah, that was one of the most extreme cases of persecution, where the dictator there, Enver Hoxha, essentially criminalizes all religious belief in 1967. In other parts of
Wow.
the Soviet Union, religion was kind of technically legal, although it was, constrictive to a tremendous degree. But in Albania, you had great repression against both Muslims, Catholics, and Orthodox in that country, and to the point it was illegal to even name your children after a name that appeared in the Bible or the Quran. And parents were often scared to give their children basic religious instruction because they were afraid the children might say something at school and they would be experience retaliation for that. So horrible, horrible situation.
Wow. Well, the last chapter is on Red Asia, and that could be almost an hour unto itself. Mao Zedong said religion is poison. And for our listeners, perhaps you've been watching, as we've encouraged you to do, the documentary Truth Rising, and one of those hosts is Oz Guinness, in which he tells early on the story of what it was like for his parents, who were missionaries in China during Mao's Cultural Revolution, and how they escaped. But Tal, here we're talking about, of course, China. We're talking about Mongolia. Of course, we can also add into it what happened later on, Pol Pot and a variety of others. But again, just an unbelievable purge of anybody with any kind of Western ideas, much less Christian or religious ideas. True?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, the persecution even goes back before the Communist Revolution. The Nationalist Party were often anti-clerical, but after 1949, you have repression. Missionaries, many were just kicked out of the country at that time. But the enormous tragedy comes in the Cultural Revolution from 1966 into the 1970s, and this was essentially a scorched earth against what Mao called the Four Olds. Different antiquated things that he thought in society, and certainly religious belief was one of them. So enormous amount of casualties and destruction of the material culture of religious communities.
One of the things you talk about is Tibet. And the question I get, and maybe I can have you try to explain it, is what is it about in the Chinese mindset such an animosity towards Tibet, the Dalai Lama, and the rest? Can you maybe unfold or unpack some of that?
There's long-standing historical claims that the Chinese essentially see Tibet as part of the Chinese empire, where Tibetans see themselves as a separate culture and a separate type of religion. So the Dalai Lama was kicked out in 1959, and during the Cultural Revolution, Tibet experienced enormous repression. Actually, one of the big kind of findings of this book for me, Education for Me, was just how Buddhism took it on the chin from communist governments in the 20th century. If you connect the dots between Mongolia, where the dictator there essentially tried to wipe out Buddhism in the 1930s, connect that with China, Tibet, Cambodia, and North Korea, it's an extraordinary tragedy. I mean, it's many other religious communities as well, but I just don't think that's known really at all here in the West.
Wow. One of the other ones that you have a chapter on Cambodia, and that gets us into the Khmer Rouge, gets us into, of course, Pol Pot, but even before that, Ho Chi Minh, and some of the things that were happening both in Vietnam and Cambodia. And it does seem to me that although when people are cataloging the great death counts that come under Stalin and certainly under Hitler and under Mao, they almost always mention Pol Pot simply because in terms of numbers, they're not as great, but in terms of percentage, perhaps one of the greatest tragedies, again, that takes place in that Asian community.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, around 20% of the population died in the late 1970s from Pol Pot's policies, and that's generally known, but I think it's less known that there was a determined effort to extirpate religion, both Western varieties, but also the type of Buddhism called Theravada Buddhism that was there. That roughly 60,000 something monks were reduced to just a few hundred. The rest either were killed or exiled. There's even these units set up called pagoda smashing units, within the paramilitary operation that would try to systematically go and decimate the material culture of Buddhism in Cambodia.
Just before I let you go, you have a conclusion where you talk about all of this, and it does seem to me that one of the reasons you wrote this is because we've had this kind of mindset that religion is the reason for all the evil. I remember Keith Ward saying that no one can deny there's not been religious wars in human history. Catholics fought Protestants, Sunni Muslims fought Shia Muslims, and the rest. But in many cases, what we were dealing with was something which had other causes that may have had a religious component. And yet, as we quoted earlier, Dinesh D'Souza or half a dozen other people, in terms of percentage and in terms of sheer numbers, the death toll from the 20th century and even now into the 21st century from these secular regimes is massive. And I think your book does a very good job of trying to at least counter some of those ideas that came out of the Enlightenment and came out of the so-called new atheist movement. And that's, I think, part of the reason you wanted to write the book, to remind people of what happens when very virulent secularist ideas begin to have favor in a country, and what happens to especially people that have religious convictions.
That's right. I mean, the body count is enormous in the 20th century, and I wanted to try to set the record straight there. I mean, to be sure, religion in various forms sometimes has contributed to violence, but the scale of this, the industrial scale, is tremendous, and that, I sort of conclude that I want to defend passive secularism, separation of church and state, as it is understood, but that these other two forms, combative and eliminationist secularism, have been, very highly ideological and at least an element in the violence of the 20th century.
Let me just mention again that we have information about you on the website, about the book, and also a link to valpo.edu, because if some young person would like to study with you and others there at Valparaiso, that is another opportunity. So again, we have all of that on our website. So Tal, thank you for being with us, and thank you for writing the book and giving us an hour today to talk about it on Point of View.
I really appreciated the conversation. Thanks for having me.
We're going to take a break, and when we come back, first of all, we'll talk about this attack on this individual from Ukraine on this train in Charlotte, and how, in some respects, first of all, the media ignored it, and then how some people tried to justify it. Then we're going to get into some of the issues of free speech that we've talked about with Lathan Watts. Also, this whole idea of, do our rights come from God or not? That's a big issue, apparently, for at least one member of the United States Senate from Virginia. The art of the 80-20 issue, and even some evidence of textbook bias. I know that'll shock you, but we have a lot to cover in this next hour, and certainly we will do so. If you'd like to know more about this book or some of the articles we'll be quoting, you can find them at the website, pointofview.net. We'll be right back.
Point of View has been listener-funded for over 50 years, and listeners who give monthly are the lifeblood of this ministry. And that is why we are inviting you to join that special team, the Truth Team. Later this month, we will celebrate Truth Team Week, highlighting the special impact you make when you become a regular supporter of Point of View. Please pray about the investment you can commit as a monthly gift during Truth Team Week. By supporting Point of View, you equip Americans to remain anchored to truth, navigating the tough moral, cultural, and political issues of the day from a biblical perspective. And also, you don't have to wait. You can join us right now. Give or learn more about the Truth Team at pointofview.net or call us at 1-800-347-5151. That's pointofview.net and 1-800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I really appreciate your program. I don't get to listen to it every day because I have to work, but it's a really a blessing to me and to all of us.
Everything you do each day to inform Christian families and our community about the things we can do, and just the way you're so informative. I listen to you daily and love you guys and appreciate you so much.
I do appreciate Point of View and what you folks are doing. You really are doing a great job to educate and to help Christian folks do a better job to honor Christ in all that we do.
I just appreciate all you guys do. I mean, I learned so much, and it's amazing what you teach that I say to other people, and they look at me like, where did you hear that? So I appreciate you guys. So thank you for all you do.
I just turned your program on, and I want to just let you know how much I appreciate just getting the truth out.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kirby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kirby Anderson.
Second hour today, broadcasting from the Good News Network studio here in Augusta, Georgia, and I think we certainly want to give you a little bit of an idea what's going to be happening for the rest of the week. We will be coming back, but certainly looking forward to the interview that Dr. Merrill Matthews will be doing tomorrow. He'll be hosting, and I might just point out this very good interview that he'll be doing in the first hour with Phil Magnus, who is with the Independent Institute, and it's all on the 1619 Project. And you may have children or grandchildren that have been studying that in school. You may have seen how that has been promoted, and I think it's very bad historical look, and is certainly inaccurate, and it is certainly not helpful. So I think if you have sometimes been looking for how do I answer the Project 1619, this is something I think you'll find helpful. Thursday is the anniversary of 9/11. We're going to have our Next Generation Roundtable. But speaking of 9/11, I might point you to this interview that we did last Tuesday. That was August 2nd. Darren Kinder was in studio with us, and we spent some time talking about his own experience there in 9/11, and I think you'll appreciate that. And then we'll have our Friday weekend edition, and then, of course, next week we'll be back to all sorts of other interviews that we're doing as well. So let me again encourage you to join us every day, but again, we're enjoying our time here in Georgia. We'll also be in South Carolina, and then we'll get back to Dallas. Let me, first of all, start off by raising a fundamental question that we've had many times in terms of the media. As a matter of fact, oftentimes when I speak to groups where we're out traveling, I remind them that it used to be when the legacy media dominated all of our ideas and really determined what news was. If Walter Cronkite didn't say it, it didn't happen. If NBC, CBS, and ABC didn't cover it, it did not exist. And one of the things you can notice is how that has changed dramatically. I've often wondered, in some respects, how do various things go viral? Now, sometimes they go viral because it strikes at the very heart of the nation, or it is something that is so jarring that we begin to think about this. But 2 weeks ago is when you have an individual by the name of Irina Zaruska, who's from originally Ukraine, who was stabbed to death by DeCarlos Brown in a light rail train in Charlotte, North Carolina. Now, this is a story that happened, as I just mentioned, 2 weeks ago, and it wasn't really covered at all. As a matter of fact, even to this day, the legacy media wants to ignore it, partially because it doesn't fit the narrative. But I want to give credit where credit is due. One of the first people that I saw cover it was Benny Johnson, who is a podcaster. And then I began to see a number of others covering it. And now even yesterday, President Trump mentioned it when he was giving his speech at the Museum of the Bible. One of the articles I thought about publishing was one that came out shortly thereafter by Charles C.W. Cook. Now, we've quoted Charles Cook on this program many times before, but his reaction is not so much about the fact that it wasn't covered, although he does address that partially, but his reaction is from the comments by the Charlotte mayor, whose name is V. Lyles. And he said in his piece, "I am in utter shock at the reaction I've seen from Charlotte's mayor, V. Lyles, to the gruesome murder that took place in the city for which she is responsible. I simply do not understand it. Lyles sounds," he says, "quite literally as if she is a hostage who, whether as the result of political pressure or corrupt ideology, has been forced to utter sentences that focus on the wrong things, that make no sense on their own terms, and that, if taken seriously, will lead inexorably to the same thing happening again." Now, you might wonder what some of those are, but I'll just give you a very short look at some of her comments. One was to propose, quote, "We will never arrest our way out of issues of homelessness and mental health." As, again, Charles Cook points out, that's nonsense. The guy who committed this crime has been arrested over and over again, including for assault, breaking and entering, robbery with a dangerous weapon, and communicating threats. He has resisted arrest. He has failed to appear in court. He has been caught multiple times in possession of a firearm, which I might point out, since he's a felon, he's prohibited from having. If instead of being out on the streets, he'd been in prison, this stabbing of this individual from Ukraine would never have happened. By the way, can you not just see the irony? She leaves Ukraine to avoid the violence there, and she's then ultimately a victim of the violence here because we can't put people in jail. Now, we've talked sometimes about this idea of criminal justice and the need for criminal justice reform. But there have been two kinds of criminal justice reform, some which have understood the importance of incarceration and deterrence, and some which have justified under the rubric of criminal justice reform to allowing people like this to be out on the streets. He points out then that if the authorities had done their job, they could have arrested their way out of this murder. I mean, he's really being facetious here, but he goes on to say, heck, they're doing that now. According to local news, the killer has been arrested, charged with first-degree murder in connection with her death. Why? Well, obviously because given his proclivities, it's understood that he must be kept away from the general public. So why not earlier? And he gives you the rap sheet if you want to look at the article. It's pretty disturbing, to put it mildly. But he goes on to say that Lyle's conclusion, that is the mayor again of Charlotte, was that the murder should force us to look at what we're doing across our community to address root causes. And again, Charles Cook says, what rot, what utter rot. There is no magical root cause that yielded this attack. There was no clever government program that could have prevented it. Crazy or not, the guy was a career criminal who should have been locked up for one of the many, many crimes he'd committed. And so the point he's making is that even when we see something that is horrific, and at this point you would hope that an individual in political office would at least say something like, we made a mistake, we shouldn't have had this person out, this was a mistake that we made, or we are going to hold judges responsible for letting career criminals out on the street. Instead, we get certain things about, well, we can't arrest our way out of homelessness and mental health. And I think there is a need for someone to stand up, if not in the city council in that city, in other places, to say we can talk about root causes, but when you have dangerous people on the streets, we need to make sure that they are not threatening the citizens. Nevertheless, that's one of those situations where, number one, it took a long time for it to go viral because the mainstream press said it really didn't fit their narrative. And yet we have seen one individual that tried to escape the violence in Ukraine become the victims of violence in America. We'll be right back.
This is Viewpoints with Kirby Anderson.
I have two neighbors that illustrate what is happening and will continue to happen in the housing market. One neighbor just sold their house for a much lower price than anyone in the neighborhood would have expected. The other neighbor bought two homes and used them as rental properties. They now live in one of those homes. People in the other rental home haven't paid their rent for 4 months. They had to go to court to evict them. They are beginning to reconsider whether rental properties are a good investment. The U.S. housing market has nearly 500,000 more sellers than buyers. In case you are wondering, this is the most on record. In some locations like Miami, sellers outnumber buyers by roughly 3-to-1. It's reasonable to assume that home prices will fall. Another news report documents how many frustrated home sellers have decided to pull their property off the market. In fact, I might mention another neighbor whose home has been on the market so long they will probably pull it off the market. 3 decades ago, I wrote a book of trends concerning baby boomers. One prediction I made was the possibility that home prices might drop. The baby boom was followed by a baby bust. That would be where you would have more sellers than buyers. The housing crisis of 2008 seemed to be a fulfillment of that. But companies like BlackRock began buying homes as investments since they were appreciating assets. If the price of houses drops, they might not be a good investment in the future. They may put even more houses on the market. If this happens, it might be good news for young people wanting to buy a home, but it would also be bad news for people or corporations who need to sell a house. I'm Kirby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kirby's booklet, A Biblical View on Critical Race Theory, go to viewpoints.info/CRT. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, we spent some time talking about free speech for just a few minutes, and a lot of that has to do with the arrest of Graham Linehan, who is a comedian and a producer. As a matter of fact, an individual that probably we'll be talking about in the future with our friend Lathan Watts, because Lathan Watts, who is, again, vice president with Alliance Defending Freedom, has been talking for some time with us as he's been in studio about the loss of any kind of free speech in the UK, and that is certainly what is actually unfolding right before our very eyes. Our next article is on the website, but let me quote from another one that I just saw as well by our good friend Robert Knight. Robert Knight says, Graham Linehan is a comedian and producer known for the UK sitcom Father Ted, and he penned 3 X posts in April which were critical of transgenderism, and he was actually posting those when he was in Arizona. Well, then he flew from Arizona to London. When he flew to London's Heathrow Airport on September 1st, this Irish citizen was met by 5 armed police officers who arrested him on suspicion of inciting violence. He has been released on bail, but I'm going to give you the rest of the story here in just a minute, and told not to go on Twitter. Of course, that's X. And it's I can read the post, but I won't because you might find it slightly offensive, but it's certainly not suggesting violence of any sort. Nigel Farage, who we've quoted before, who is the leader of the UK Reform UK Party, said he's an Irish citizen. This could happen to any man or woman from America that goes to Heathrow that has said things online that the British government or the British police don't like. It goes on to say, at what point did the UK become North Korea? Well, I think the Irish comedy writer found out 2 days ago on Heathrow Airport. Robert Knight actually has a column that came out yesterday, and it had the title, Leftists in Britain and America Have No Respects for Free Speech, because shortly after talking about this particular arrest of Graham Lineman, he then goes and talks about what we'll get into in just a few minutes, and that is the statements by the Virginia Senator Tim Kaine about whether or not our rights come from God rather than from the government. But I'll leave that for just a few minutes because we'll get into it, because my first article on the website is from Charles Cook, who again is shocked. Now, again, to understand his reaction, you've got to understand that he originally is from England, and he points out that if you click on the link, and you'll see that there is really not much more, because the headline was, the writer of TV's Father Ted has been arrested in Heathrow over 3 social media posts on transgender issues. And so he says, if you click on the link, you'll get a little bit more to the piece, but really there's really nothing more, if you will, than what's contained in those 19 words. Because here, as he says, with great shock, this is England. This is not North Korea. It's not Russia. It's not China. This is England, the land of John Stuart Mill and Thomas Paine, or from my buddies, Monty Python. I knew I'd get a smile over here from a few of my buddies. For tweets on transgender issues. Tweets, not threats of imminent violence or critical vow to blow up an airport upon arrival. These are tweets. I'm not even sure we call them tweets now that we don't have Twitter, but whatever you want to call those things on X, on issues about which people profoundly disagree. Now, Charles Cook goes on to say, since I moved to the United States in 2011, I've been chronicling the increasingly illiberal attitude to free expression that has been adopted in my country of birth. But this one, he says, I will confess, surprises even me. Typically, I appeal to the First Amendment as the quintessential example of how things ought to be. Here, I do not have to go that far. Here is the British censorial attitude, not American permissiveness, but on the outlier of the world stage. He says, I have no brief for Canada or Germany or New Zealand, but bad as they may be when compared to the United States, I cannot imagine any of them would have engaged in the same behavior given the same facts. This one, he says, is egregious on an entirely new scale. He goes on to say the worst part, and I love this because he's thought this through, is that it happened at Heathrow Airport. Why? Because that confirms that it was planned. Sometimes police officers overreact or act rashly or misinterpret the law, but this was as deliberate and as premeditated as it gets, because they sent no fewer than 5 officers, as he says, enough to staff a basketball team, the better to ensure that a policeman has each leg and a policeman for each thumb, and as a result can come after him. And that's the point. We recognize that sometimes when there has been some kind of breach of etiquette, sometimes there's been an attack on free speech or an attack on the freedom of religion, and we've been able to actually talk about that with, for example, the barrister of England, the lawyer from England, Paul Diamond, he's kind of the Jay Sekulow, Kelly Shackelford of the lawyers in England. Paul Diamond will point out that sometimes police officers, or back there they call them bobbies, will go and say something or do something or eliminate something that they shouldn't. But this is, as again Charles Cook points out, was premeditated, and again just an illustration that it was deliberate and premeditated. A little bit later he goes on to say the nature of his arrest renders the contrast as clear as it could possibly be. Yesterday, Linehan was in the United States, living his life, sharing his opinions, enjoying his independence. Today's in England, under observation, subject to surveillance, at liberty only if he vows not to speak where people might hear. Of course, that's where that is the ban on the use of what we call Twitter, or now called X. He does say one other thing before we wind down this segment, and that is, I cannot quite put a finger on why, but all of this seems to me wholly appropriate that immediately after the comedian was arrested for speaking, he was taken to the National Health Service-run hospital to recover. That evidently is the new British mode. In year 2025, Britain has a parliament that can meet to help you kill yourself, but not to protect your speech, where it can pluck the population's feathers from 9,000 different angles, but that it has no interest in generating, for example, wealth and its network of police forces that, as he points out, are incapable of solving the most sordid crimes imaginable, but are sufficiently well-staffed to guarantee that if an outspoken Irish comedian steps off a plane from Arizona, there will be enough lawmen to fill a small office. And so, again, just an individual that has been watching how this has unfolded in England, and as we've pointed out before, probably a good reason for us in this country to once again celebrate America's godly heritage. If you go to our website today, you will see, first of all, that we have a banner that says 250 years restoring America's godly heritage. If you're one of those individuals that receives some of the booklets, we send out these booklets. The most recent one is One Nation Under God. We send those to those of you that are part of the Truth Team. And in about a week or two, we're going to encourage some of you that maybe aren't members of the Truth Team to do so, because you will receive not only the Outlook magazine, but the booklets. And the most recent one is One Nation Under God. And the one coming out, I sometimes don't publicize what's coming, but since it's about ready to be mailed in the next week or two, it's on the Bill of Rights, which has that very difficult phrase, at least for our friends in England, about freedom of speech as well as freedom of religion. So we recognize how important it's going to be in this year as we come to 250 years after the Declaration of Independence. We're going to do more and more to educate you, your children, and your grandchildren about the importance of America's godly heritage. So again, you'll see some of that information there. And if you'd like one of those booklets on a biblical view on One Nation Under God, we'd be glad to make it available to you. But one of the best ways, of course, is to click on that button that says donate and become a Truth Team member. We'll be sending it to you as well. I might mention we also have my viewpoint commentary today, some take action items, which we'll get to as well, and a variety of other resources, all available on the website pointofview.net. And in particular, we haven't talked much about the action item. Maybe we'll do that a little bit later, but there are some ways in which we can stand up for freedom and stand up for free speech and make sure that people aren't canceled or debanked. All that information is available at our website, pointofview.net. We'll come back with more right after this.
It almost seems like we live in a different world from many people in positions of authority. They say men can be women and women men. People are prosecuted differently or not at all, depending on their politics. Criminals are more valued and rewarded than law-abiding citizens. It's so overwhelming, so demoralizing. You feel like giving up. But we can't. We shouldn't. We must not. As Winston Churchill said to Britain in the darkest days of World War II, never give in, never give in, never, 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 never yield to force, never yield to the apparently overwhelming might of the enemy. And that's what we say to you today. This is not a time to give in, but to step up and join Point of View in providing clarity in the chaos. We can't do it alone, but together, with God's help, we will overcome the darkness. Invest in biblical clarity today at pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. Pointofview.net and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kirby Anderson.
Back once again, broadcasting from Augusta, Georgia, and I'm going to get into a couple of their issues that we've posted on the website. Let me just mention real quickly in passing that my Viewpoints commentary today is about an issue we're very concerned about. The younger you are, the less likely you are to be able to own a home, and that has always been part of the American dream. So I write about this today, in which there are more sellers than buyers in the housing market. For those of you that are in Florida, right now in Miami, sellers outside buyers 3-1. Now, I think it is reasonable to assume, in light of some of this, that some of the house prices will come down. We'll be watching over the next few days whether or not the insurance and interest rates might go down, and a variety of other things, because that is an issue. So I kind of take you through a little bit of the historical issue, and it's certainly one that we're going to be following here on Point of View. So maybe there is news on the horizon, and I'll get into that perhaps in future programs. But I just thought I'd mention that commentary is there for you today. If you would like to receive these commentaries, they are free of charge, and you just simply can click on that button that says I never miss a viewpoint, and that is a viewpoint commentary. Mine arrive in your inbox Monday through Friday. Penedexter's arrives on Saturday. One of the other articles I've posted here has to do with something we've been talking about, and that is Senator Tim Kaine, senator from Virginia, was in the news because he said the notion that our rights do not come from our laws or our government should make people very, very nervous. Now, one of the reasons I posted this article by Joshua Arnold is because I think he does the best job of putting the entire statement by Senator Kaine in context. I'm always careful that sometimes when you pull just one quote out of context, that it sometimes is not helpful. And he really goes into, with a little bit more patience and tenacity than most people, to talk about where that 4-minute, if you will, monologue went. And oftentimes people just take that one quote or the reaction from Senator Ted Cruz and don't really give it some historical and even kind of linguistic context. But that being said, I think it is very clear to understand that we certainly should understand that he was reacting to a statement that came from an individual who is Riley Barnes, who was nominated to become the Assistant Secretary of State for the Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor. In other words, he would serve under the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio. And in opening statements, when you go through a confirmation hearing, and these confirmation hearings are moving at a glacial pace, they're just moving so slowly. Nevertheless, he made this statement, and here's what he said. We are a nation of individuals, each made in the image of God and possessing an inherent dignity. He then followed up by talking about the fact that this was a truth that our founders understood as essential to American self-government. He also said that we are a nation founded on a powerful principle, and that powerful principle is that all men are created equal because our rights come from God, our Creator, not from our laws, not from our governments. And that was enough to set off Tim Kaine to go into this about 4-minute dialogue here, which he says this notion that rights don't come from laws and don't come from the government, but from the Creator. Well, that's what the Iranian government believes. And he goes on to even make the statement that it's a theocratic regime that bases its rule on Sharia law, targets Sunnis, Baha'is, Jews, Christians, and other religious minorities. And they do it because they believe that they understand what natural laws are from their Creator. Now, after that, he went on and made some other statements. First of all, he never really granted or seemed to be aware that the philosophy he was attacking was in the Declaration of Independence. And again, even as Joshua Arnold, I think, does a good job, says maybe due to poor listening, Kaine tried to refute Barnes' worldview by claiming much of the same ground in terms of natural rights. But we have to understand that whether we take this statement by Senator Tim Kaine from Virginia, or whether we, of course, take, Thomas Jefferson, the Declaration of Independence, or let's take another Virginian, James Madison, who said it's the duty of every man to render to the Creator such homage and such only as he believes to be acceptable to him. This duty is precedent to the claims of civil society. And again, if you receive our booklet on a biblical view on one nation under God, or our future one on a Bill of Rights, you can see where those ideas come from. But rather than try to say that this was maybe a one-off with Senator Kaine, let me also remind you that not so long ago, one of the writers for Politico warned that believing human rights don't come from Congress. This is what she says. Heidi Pritzbula says, by believing that human rights don't come from Congress, they don't come from the Supreme Court, they come from God, this would make you a Christian nationalist. And so again, we can see that there is a fundamental misunderstanding of some of these ideas. And even more recently, John Stonestreet points out, what is the possible if you will, conclusion or outcome of that? And so later on in his commentary points out that Joseph Stalin oversaw the executions of 800,000 political opponents and put to death probably about 20 million. In China, under Mao Zedong, 15 to 45 million people were slaughtered, and under Cambodia, under Pol Pot, or Germany under Nazi Germany and Adolf Hitler, the same, related very much to the conversation we just had a few minutes ago from Dr. Thomas Albert Howard. So I think it's important to recognize that what we are dealing with today are individuals that are absolutely convinced that if you hold to this idea that God is the one that gives us rights, then we are going to be dangerous to this sort of secularist idea. And that brings me to a last piece before we take our break by Josh Hammer, in which he talks about the art of the 80-20 issue. You might kind of know what he's talking about here. And that is Donald Trump, President Donald Trump, has this ability sometimes to find issues where at least 80% of Americans agree. And then by taking a stand on that issue, and the most recent one is, of course, the National Guard being deployed possibly to crime-ridden Chicago or Baltimore, but already, of course, deployed to Washington, D.C., what ends up happening then is the 20%, or sometimes it's 90-10 to 10%, tend to react, and they find themselves on the wrong issue. Some of the statements he made yesterday about prayer and about religious liberty, I'm already starting to see some people say, no, we can't have this. Donald Trump is now calling for a theocracy. This is going to be the end of the republic as we know it. And so, again, you can see one more example of what Josh Hammer calls the art of the 80-20 issue, because he will go to what he says the particular issue that American people agree with, and the American people are with him. And again, you can take the most recent one. Any survey you look at shows that the American public consistently rank crime and safety among their top concerns. It's usually in the top 5 issues, and one of the top 5 issues whenever they do general election exit polling. And so as a result, when he floats a proposal out about sending the National Guard to Chicago or Baltimore, the knee-jerk reaction always puts them again in that 20% range. As he spoke yesterday on the issue of prayer, on the issue of religious convictions, on the issue of religious liberty, again, you can see how I think they're going to once again fall into that 80-20, because even people that aren't Christians still say, well, I sort of believe in a God, and I think religion's probably a good idea. And so on every particular issue, Trump, as he says here, floats an idea. Democrats and some of the people in the media won't respond with nuance. They respond with a knee-jerk outrage, just as they did in many of the other actions. And on it goes, and it ends up being politically devastating, he says, for the left. Moreover, the recent history has been on Trump's side. So if nothing else, Josh Hammer refers to it as the art of the 80-20 issue, along, as he says, with his sheer sense of humor. Trump's instinctual knack for picking such winning battles has become one of his greatest political assets. And so, again, I thought you might like to read that article. I've only given you a brief summary of an individual that has noticed time and time again, by picking these 80-20 issues, Donald Trump seems to rise in the polls, and his opponents seem to scratch their head trying to figure out why. Maybe it's because they're on the wrong side of where most Americans are. Let's take a break. We have one more topic to address. We'll do that right after this.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes. I would just spend a few minutes talking about textbook bias. Very good piece by Daniel Buck, who's at the American Enterprise Institute. And as a good lead-in to the conversation that Dr. Merrill Matthews will have with Phil Magnus tomorrow. Phil Magnus will be talking about what is called the 1619 Project. And if you're concerned about what your children or grandchildren might be studying in the public schools, or even sometimes in the charter schools or Christian schools without some discernment, this, I think, is a very important article and the conversation he's going to have tomorrow as well. This particular article is our last article on the website at pointofview.net, is entitled Textbook Bias is a Real Problem. And the reason I wanted to focus on this, because we have been talking about what was being taught in the schools, and oftentimes I say that because of the lack of teaching about America's godly heritage, not only do parents, but children and even grandchildren don't even know some of the history of our country, which is why we produce this booklet on a One Nation Under God, and we'll be producing others. It turns out that Daniel Buck points out that some of that has to do with the publishers themselves. He says if you skim through the voting section on McGraw-Hill's civics textbook, you'll see images from Hillary Clinton's campaign and Elizabeth Warren's campaign, while you will notice that one campaign photos of a recent victor who won the popular election are notably absent. No surprise there. He says, grab the same publisher's world history textbook, and you read that the first Intifada was a mostly unarmed uprising against Israel occupation, conveniently omitting discussion of the 200 murdered Jews, a small oversight, some might say. And so the point he's making is there's quite a bit of bias. And so even though there have been some attempts to remove various bias, DEI or CRT or other kinds of things as well from the classrooms, progressivism still is very much entrenched in the institutions. Matter of fact, off air, I was talking with some people saying in some respects all they've done is go into hiding with the hope that maybe we can get a new Supreme Court that won't declare some of these actions unconstitutional. Maybe we can hope that we'll win the next election. And so he takes you through a couple of the publishers, one that I just mentioned, McGraw-Hill. Let's take another one. In 2022, Pearson Education launched its Pride 365 initiative, and that was intended to incorporate LGBTQ themes into classrooms every day of the year. They even have a guide to LGBT language inclusivity, complete with student workbooks, teaches children about non-binary gender pronouns, LGBTQ activism, even encouraging a shift from grammatically gendered to gender fluid language. And sometimes people say, where does this all come from? We talk about some of that in our booklet on transgenderism. We talk about some of it in our booklet on wokeism. Ideas come from the classroom, and to see the increasing number of individuals today who identify themselves as non-binary or gender fluid didn't happen in a vacuum. It happened through social media, but it also happened through the textbooks there as well. Let's talk about another one, Scholastic. We all probably remember that when we were in school. Best known for their book fairs, but again, even though they were known, for those of us a little bit older, for having wonderful books about puppies and fairies and a variety of other things, now they have their LGBTQIA graphic novels to children as young as 4 years of age. And I started the program by reminding you that when President Donald Trump was at the Museum of the Bible, one of the individuals that he actually introduced to the audience was this middle school young man who, I think at the time he was in 5th grade, was encouraged to mentor these kindergartner kids. And he was reading from some of these textbooks and some of these children's stories. Even to call them textbooks is not much. They're really kind of children's programs that if I read them on the air, I think you would find offensive, and yet that was exactly what was taking place. So as he points out, the commitment to progressive dogma extends beyond gender. Another one of those publishers, Houghton Mifflin, announced its support for Black Lives Matter, establishing a Black Alliance employee group. Cengage, another leading producer of educational content, is also committed to reinventing education, issuing a slew of press releases on just about any social justice cause you might imagine. And so again, these ideas don't just stay in a vacuum. They actually talk about the fact that they have an equity advisory board at McGraw-Hill, that these begin to trickle down into these various materials. And the other day, Fox News reported that if you look at the Pearson AP History textbook, so this is for those of us that took us advanced placement, for the AP History textbook, the edition which is approved on the College Board website, it depicts Trump's election as a racist and white majority reacting in fear to the ethnic diversity of this country, and Trump himself as mentally unstable. So this is an AP-approved textbook. Now, I suspect because of this visibility, that probably won't last very long. But even here, let me just give you could read it for yourself, because that's why we post this article for you to read on the website. In the closing paragraphs, the particular textbook says, the United States has been less has less equality of opportunity than almost any other advanced industrial country, and proposes that the American dream is a myth. So again, you can see that you're getting a very biased view. And so whether it is the kinds of things that sometimes we have seen taught by Howard Zinn, or the things which, again, Dr. Merle Matthews will be talking about tomorrow in the 1619 Project, we really just wanted you to be aware of that. And if you find yourself saying, I want to take some of this to my school board, or maybe I want to convince my spouse. Maybe you're the husband who's trying to convince your wife. Maybe you're the wife trying to convince your husband that maybe we need to get our kids out of the schools. This 3-pager just takes you through a lot of the bias that is there. And it's a good illustration, again, that we need to pay attention not only to what is being provided to our children through the social media, whether they're looking at Instagram or TikTok or a variety of others, but we also should be paying attention to the fact that many of these textbooks really have an agenda as well. And sadly, sometimes those textbooks are picked up by the Christian schools thinking, well, that's a good way to teach history or to teach civics or to teach a variety of other topics. And I think it's why what I would always mention, buyer beware. Caveat emptor is a very important principle. So this last article, while kids are back in school, textbook bias is a real problem. Daniel Buck has brought the receipts, and I think you can see why you should pay attention to what your kids are learning, the textbooks they're reading, and maybe to consider whether or not to consider an alternative. Well, that's all we have for today. It has been a wonderful time to be here in Augusta, Georgia. We'll be in Georgia and South Carolina in the next couple of days. Look forward to seeing some of you face-to-face. But again, I want to thank Good News Network for being such gracious hosts. I want to thank both Megans there back in the studio, as well as Steve for their help. And I also want to thank Jana for engineering here in this studio, because this is just a great opportunity to get out and to meet some of the people and to talk about what is happening in our culture. Once again, visit the website pointofview.net, and we'll see you back here tomorrow right here on Point of View.
Point of View has been listener-funded for over 50 years, and listeners who give monthly are the lifeblood of this ministry. And that is why we are inviting you to join that special team, the Truth Team. Later this month, we will celebrate Truth Team Week, highlighting the special impact you make when you become a regular supporter of Point of View. Please pray about the investment you can commit as a monthly gift during Truth Team Week. By supporting Point of View, you equip Americans to remain anchored to truth, navigating the tough moral, cultural, and political issues of the day from a biblical perspective. And also, you don't have to wait. You can join us right now. Give or learn more about the Truth Team at pointofview.net or call us at 1-800-347-5151. That's pointofview.net and 1-800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.